What if the most shocking love story in the 90-Day Fiancé universe was never filmed, never teased in trailers, and never leaked by insiders until it became impossible to hide? For more than a year, fans believed they knew everything about Tim Malcolm and Tiffany Franco. Their struggles, their heartbreaks, their very public lives all played out on screen. But behind the scenes, far away from social media and the spotlight, a very different story was unfolding. For the past year and a half, Tim Malcolm and Tiffany Franco have reportedly been involved in a secret romantic relationship. They avoided attention, kept off social media, and met privately, often booking rooms at five-star hotels. No photos, no public appearances, no overlap that could raise suspicion. According to confidential sources, even more shocking details eventually surfaced. Tiffany Franco is reportedly pregnant and expecting twins. The information was kept quiet for as long as possible, but mounting pressure made secrecy impossible. Not long after the relationship became public, another revelation followed. Tim Malcolm allegedly gifted Tiffany a luxury home valued at $1 million, sending shockwaves through the fan community. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Tim Malcolm and Tiffany Franco have reportedly set their wedding date for January 15th, 2026. Tonight, this story feels almost unreal, yet every detail seems to fit too perfectly to ignore. This is not just a love story. It's a reckoning. It didn't begin with romance, at least not in any obvious way. When Tim and Tiffany first crossed paths again after their separate 90-Day Fiancé journeys, there were no headlines and no flirtation. Just polite conversations at franchise events and brief backstage interactions that seemed forgettable. That was exactly what made it work. Sources close to production circles say casual check-ins slowly turned into long late-night conversations. Messages were exchanged only when cameras were off. There was an unspoken agreement to keep everything invisible. For Tim, privacy meant control. For Tiffany, secrecy meant safety. Neither could afford another public collapse. Over time, their communication shifted. Casual became consistent. Consistent became intentional. They stopped meeting in public and instead coordinated travel schedules. Hotels were booked under alternate names. Cities with active fan communities were avoided. No photos, no shared posts, no witnesses willing to talk. For nearly a year and a half, their relationship existed in fragments. A weekend here, a single night there, always behind closed doors, always temporary, always intense. According to sources, it wasn't just about attraction. It was about understanding. Tim admired Tiffany's strength. Tiffany trusted Tim's calm nature. Where one was emotional, the other was controlled. Where one had been burned in public, the other knew how to disappear. But secrecy has a price. As the months passed, emotions grew heavier. What began as an escape slowly turned into dependence. They weren't just hiding from fans anymore. They were hiding from reality, and reality was closing in. Because silence doesn't protect you forever. Eventually, it traps you. Every secret relationship leaves a pattern, not loud or obvious, but consistent. For Tim and Tiffany, that pattern wasn't in photos or online clues. It showed up in unexplained absences, missed calls, and travel schedules that only lined up with each other. Insiders familiar with their movements say the timeline became clear early last year. Both became harder to reach. Messages went unanswered for hours. Friends noticed sudden weekend disappearances. Both began traveling far more than their work required. They were careful. They never flew together. They didn't arrive at the same time. They never checked in under recognizable names. One would arrive first. The other followed hours later. Different entrances, different floors, one final door. The locations were always chosen carefully. Large cities, hotels known for privacy, staff trained not to ask questions, rooms booked for short stays, rarely longer than 2 nights. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. They followed strict rules. No photos, no shared rides, no public overlap. Even room service was timed separately. Elevators were avoided. But time changes people. As months passed, secrecy stopped being about logistics and started becoming emotional. Quick visits turned into longer stays. Light conversations became heavy ones. Future plans crept into talks they never meant to have. Friends close to Tiffany noticed she stopped chasing opportunities she once wanted. Tim, known for structure, began canceling commitments at the last minute. Both showed signs of people living two lives, one for the world and one behind a locked door. By the time their relationship passed the 1-year mark, secrecy was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. There were too many memories, too many promises, and too much to lose. This wasn't a fling that lasted too long by accident. It was a deliberate relationship that simply outgrew the shadows. And no timeline stays frozen forever. Luxury wasn't about showing off. It was camouflage. According to sources, 5-star hotels were chosen for anonymity, not extravagance. In places where privacy is part of the service, names are forgotten, questions are never asked, and discretion is guaranteed. Their routine became precise. Rooms under secondary identities, check-ins during busy hours, private elevators when possible, suites far from high-traffic floors. Staff rotated often enough that familiarity never formed. Once together, they rarely left their rooms. No dinners downstairs, no spa visits, no poolside sightings. Everything came to them: meals, drinks, conversations, confessions. Inside those rooms, the outside world disappeared. For Tiffany, it was freedom from judgment. For Tim, it was control without explanation. But luxury has a way of amplifying emotions. In quiet, polished spaces, feelings grow louder. Conversations deepen. Silences stretch. Unspoken truths become heavier than words. Sources say not every night was romantic. Some were tense. Some were uncertain. Arguments happened quietly, behind closed doors, where no one else could hear. And that's where the story truly began to change. Decisions were delayed. Questions about what this really was surfaced, then were pushed aside. 5-star walls can hide sound, but they can't hide the truth. Over time, the shadows they lived in stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like pressure. The secrecy that once felt exciting slowly became suffocating. They were no longer hiding from fans. They were hiding from consequences. And consequences don't care how expensive the room is. By the end of this phase, something had shifted. The meetings were no longer just escapes. They became checkpoints in a relationship that was moving forward, whether either of them was ready or not. 5-star shadows can keep you hidden, but they can't stop time. And time was about to demand a price. Every secret relationship reaches a moment when the rules stop working. For Tim Malcolm and Tiffany Franco, that moment didn't come through a fight or a scandal. It came quietly, disguised as comfort. Sources say the shift happened during what was supposed to be a short, routine meetup. No long stay, no emotional talks, just another controlled escape. But that night felt different, less guarded, less temporary. They talked longer than usual about past mistakes, public judgment, and how exhausting it was to constantly explain themselves to an audience that only knew edited versions of their lives. That conversation crossed a line neither of them named, but both of them felt. From that moment on, the relationship stopped being something they visited and became something they lived, even if only in pieces. Phone calls replaced texts. Decisions began to include the other person. Walking away no longer felt simple or clean. But crossing emotional lines brings consequences. Friends noticed the change. Tiffany's inner circle heard hesitation when she talked about future plans. Tim, usually distant, became defensive when asked about sudden schedule changes. These weren't coincidences. They were signs. What made this phase dangerous wasn't exposure. It was attachment. According to insiders, boundaries that once existed for safety began to blur. Tim stayed longer than planned. Tiffany rearranged commitments to match his availability. They stopped pretending it was casual, even if they still pretended it was invisible. With deeper attachment came deeper fear. Fear of being discovered. Fear of judgment. Fear of repeating past mistakes, this time together. Crossing the line didn't mean they wanted to go public. It meant the secret had grown too big to manage. Too many shared moments. Too many private promises. Too many nights where ending things felt heavier than the risk of being seen. This is where most hidden relationships collapse. Not because of betrayal, but because the truth demands space. And in their case, that truth was already moving forward, quietly and relentlessly, toward a moment neither of them could delay much longer. Because the next chapter wouldn't be about feelings. It would be about consequences no amount of planning could contain. There are moments that permanently change the direction of a secret. For Tiffany Franco and Tim Malcolm, that moment arrived without warning. According to confidential sources, the first signs weren't dramatic. They were subtle. A missed cycle, fatigue that didn't feel normal, a quiet sense that something was different. Tiffany reportedly didn't panic at first. She waited carefully, hoping the feeling would pass. It didn't. When confirmation came, the reality was heavier than either of them had prepared for. Not just pregnant, but pregnant with twins. 2 lives, 2 futures, and no way to hide what was coming. Sources say the news stunned Tim, not because of doubt, but because of timing. Everything they had built relied on control and secrecy. And suddenly both were gone. There is no discreet way to explain a pregnancy. There is no silent way to prepare for twins. The conversations that followed were described as intense and raw. No more avoidance. No half answers. Just reality closing in. What do we do? When do we tell people? Can we keep this quiet, and for how long? For weeks they tried. Loose clothing, limited appearances, carefully crafted excuses. Only a small circle knew. And even then, the information was controlled and incomplete. But pressure always builds. Tiffany reportedly struggled under the weight of secrecy. Every appointment felt like a lie. Every public smile felt borrowed. Tim shifted into protection mode, focusing on housing, finances, timelines, and security. This wasn't about romance anymore. It was about responsibility. Insiders say this was the moment the relationship stopped being optional. Any doubts that existed before no longer mattered. 2 children were coming, and they deserved stability, not shadows. But going public meant everything would change. Careers, reputations, fan perception, control of the narrative. The pregnancy wasn't just a surprise. It was a deadline. Time doesn't negotiate, and secrets don't survive. Ultrasound photos, a growing belly, a calendar that refused to slow down. The question wasn't if the truth would come out. It was how explosive the fallout would be when it did. Secrets rarely collapse on their own. They collapse under pressure. As Tiffany's pregnancy progressed beyond what could be hidden, the walls around them began to close in. First quietly, then all at once. It started with whispers. A stylist asking the wrong question. A friend noticing repeated travel overlaps. A production insider hearing something they weren't meant to hear. Nothing confirmed, just fragments. But fragments become dangerous when they start to align. Sources say Tiffany felt the pressure first. Public appearances became harder. Her energy dropped. Her patience thinned. Cameras, angles, and timing became constant worries. Every appearance felt like borrowed time. Tim faced a different pressure. Questions about sudden financial planning, urgency around property discussions, requests for privacy clauses and legal consultations. To those who knew him well, the change was clear. He wasn't just protecting his image anymore. He was preparing for impact. Behind the scenes, conversations turned strategic, not emotional, not romantic. When do we go public? Who finds out first? How do we control the story before it controls us? Because once the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just affect them. It would affect fans, contracts, and reputations built over years. Then came the leaks. Not headlines, just hints. Rumors in fan forums. Blurred photos. A sudden wave of people checking in. Sources say that's when silence stopped working. It wasn't protecting them anymore. It was feeding suspicion. Going public wouldn't stop the fallout, but it would shape it. And shaping the story mattered. Because if they didn't speak first, someone else would. And that version would be harsher and far less forgiving. The pressure didn't force them to reveal the truth out of guilt. It forced them to choose control over collapse. By the end of this chapter, one thing was clear. The secret was over. The silence didn't end with a dramatic announcement. It ended with a decision. According to sources close to the situation, Tim Malcolm and Tiffany Franco knew the truth had to come out on their terms. Not through leaks, not through speculation, not through someone else's headline. Family reactions were mixed, but not chaotic. Shock came first, then silence, then questions that had no easy answers. Some were supportive immediately, others needed time. Twins changed everything. This wasn't just news. It was a reality that couldn't be negotiated or delayed. Once family knew, the circle slowly widened. Close friends were told next, carefully and selectively. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Surprise, disbelief, then concern about what this would mean once the public found out. Because everyone understood the same truth. This story wouldn't stay private for long. Behind the scenes, preparation began. Tim became methodical. Meetings with lawyers, discussions about finances, conversations about long-term stability. Sources say this was when the house purchase entered the picture, not as a gesture, but as a foundation, a place that represented permanence instead of temporary rooms and borrowed time. The luxury home wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about control, about creating a space that belonged to them, not hotels, not schedules, not secrecy. For Tiffany, it symbolized safety. For Tim, it was responsibility made tangible. At the same time, the emotional weight increased. Tiffany reportedly struggled with the loss of anonymity. Pregnancy brought attention she couldn't deflect forever. Her body was changing. Her energy shifted. Hiding became exhausting. Each day felt like managing a countdown no one else could see. Tim, meanwhile, carried a different burden. He understood how fast public opinion could turn. He had lived through it before. He knew that once the story broke, it wouldn't be gentle. There would be disbelief, criticism, speculation, and accusations. Motives would be questioned. Timelines would be dissected. Nothing would be taken at face value. That's why the decision to go public wasn't emotional. It was calculated. According to insiders, they debated timing for weeks. Too early, and they risked chaos without preparation. Too late, and they risked losing control completely. The pregnancy set the pace. Doctor's appointments, visible changes, and unavoidable documentation made delay impossible. The truth wasn't waiting anymore. It was advancing. When the relationship was finally revealed, reactions came fast. Shock dominated the first wave. Fans questioned how this could have happened without anyone noticing. Old interviews were revisited. Past statements were reanalyzed. People searched for clues that now seemed obvious in hindsight. The gift of the house intensified the reaction. Some saw it as generosity. Others saw it as excessive. Online debate exploded. But behind the noise, the intention remained unchanged. Stability, preparation, accountability. Then came the announcement that sealed it. The wedding date, January 15th, 2026. Sources say that date wasn't chosen for symbolism or spectacle. It was practical. It allowed time for the pregnancy, for adjustment, for public fallout to settle. It marked a future point where secrecy would no longer define them. Planning the wedding wasn't glamorous. It was cautious. Guest lists were tight. Security was considered. Every detail was filtered through one question. Does this protect the children? Because by this point, everything centered on that. The twins. Their arrival reframed every decision. Public image mattered less than private stability. As the news spread, reactions split into predictable camps. Some fans expressed support, praising their decision to step forward. Others accused them of deception. Questions about timelines dominated conversations. People wanted answers that didn't exist in simple terms. Insiders say both Tim and Tiffany expected this. Neither was surprised by skepticism. What mattered was that the truth was no longer hidden. It was out, imperfect and exposed, but real. Behind closed doors, adjustments continued. Schedules changed. Priorities shifted. Public appearances were carefully chosen. Statements were brief. Silence, when used, was intentional now, not fearful. Tiffany reportedly focused on her health and preparing for motherhood. Tim stayed in problem-solving mode, managing logistics and planning for long-term security. They weren't pretending this was easy. It wasn't. The relationship itself changed under the light. What once thrived in privacy now had to exist under scrutiny. That transition wasn't smooth. Sources say there were moments of doubt, stress, and frustration. But there was also commitment. The kind that comes not from romance, but from shared responsibility. They didn't try to rewrite their past. They didn't deny the secrecy. They acknowledged it quietly by moving forward instead of explaining backward. As the months passed, public interest stabilized. The shock dulled. New stories replaced old ones. But this relationship didn't fade into background noise. It remained a point of fascination because it defied expectations. Two people known for very different public personas had built something that no one saw coming. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. And that's what unsettled people.